The vast majority of the world's climate scientists say we're in deep trouble. Our world is getting warmer, and the cause, they say, is human activity, specifically the burning of fossil fuels. Needless to say, this has a lot of people very worried. But in this video, I'm going to show how, in a certain sense, we've been here before. We're in an age of air now, a period where the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn are happening in air signs. And astrology can be incredibly literal sometimes, in a way that almost seems unserious to outsiders. Because in ages of air, we see problems with the air. I don't make the rules. So climate change is one of several factors that coalesce to define history during these air epochs. And among the others are transformative plagues, mass migration, and the dissolution of rigid structures and hierarchies. In this episode, we're going to examine 4 previous ages of air and see how these factors played into the major historical developments of those periods. And we're going to see how these factors aren't only linked through the archetype of air. Scientists are concluding that they're causally linked too. And we're also going to see how nomadic peoples forced into action by climate change have played enormously important roles in history during these air epochs. Peoples like the Mongols, the Huns, and the Sea Peoples. So get ready for another journey into astrology and history that might shed light on the nature of our current times. Ready? Then let's get into it. First of all, if you aren't familiar with the astrology of all this, what do I mean when I say an age of air? I already have a long video on this subject. Find it on my channel page if you want to watch it later. But in brief, these elemental ages are formed from the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. They conjoin every 20 years, but due to the geometry of the solar system and the zodiac, they tend to meet in signs of the same element for stretches of roughly 200 years at a time. This gives us an 800-year cycle. 200 years of fire, 200 years of earth, 200 years of air, and then 200 years of water. This is a simplified version of what really happens. In reality, these ages are a bit messier because retrogrades mean there is a bit of a back and forth between these elements at the beginning and end. But we've just moved from an age of earth to an age of air. In the age of earth, roughly the 19th and 20th centuries, was the period of the Industrial Revolution, the triumph of global capitalism, and the adoption of extremely materialist conceptions of reality. Now in 1980, we saw the first Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in an air sign for hundreds of years. That was in Libra. Then in 2000, there was one last Earth conjunction in the sign of Taurus. But in 2020, we had a conjunction in Aquarius. Now it's going to be nothing but air conjunctions until 2159. So we're really in the age of air now. The period of 1980 to 2020 was a kind of transitional period, a move from earth to air. Those of you of the right age will remember that there was an environmental issue involving the air that emerged into public consciousness around the time of that 1980 Libra conjunction, the hole in the ozone layer.
Scientists discovered a weak spot in the ozone layer over Antarctica, the icy continent at the South Pole. Satellite photos show that a hole opens for a few months during Antarctica's springtime.
But you don't hear about the hole in the ozone layer anymore. Scientists figured out that the hole was being caused by chemicals called CFCs that were found in fridges and spray cans. And there was a global agreement to ban the use of these chemicals in 1989. In other words, we kind of fixed that problem. Yes, it seems sometimes we can actually do stuff like that. In retrospect though, the hole in the ozone layer was a kind of omen for the greater problem of climate change we were going to face in the age of air. Now we'll return to the current moment at the end of the video. But first, we're going to look at 4 previous ages of air. And our first stop will be an event that historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, close to the beginning of an age of air, several civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians, all collapsed at the same time. We don't know for sure why it happened, but whatever happened, happened suddenly and violently. There's a lot of evidence for it. There are abandoned settlements and ruined cities. There are destruction layers of burned buildings and walls. There are written sources attesting to the collapse. And there's evidence of large patterns of migration. And one factor that's always cited as causing this collapse is invasions by a confederation of raiders known to history as the Sea Peoples. We don't know exactly who the Sea Peoples were, but something drove them to invade all these settled civilizations in the Mediterranean around the same time. And climate change is a prime suspect. Researchers in Cyprus believe that a 300-year drought pushed the sea peoples to invade. They examined layers of lake sediment which suggest that around 1200 BC, around the time that our Age of Air began, agriculture in the region came to a halt, and it didn't start up again until about 850 BC. The researchers believe that this climate shift would have brought crop failures and famines that led to socio-economic crises that forced the sea peoples to invade. And the result of these destructive invasions was a period of fragmentation and decentralization. So we have a lot of airy themes here: migration, decentralization, structural dissolution, and climate change. If you're enjoying this video, please do me a favor and give me a like. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and make sure you don't miss more of this content. Now we're going to fast forward about 800 years to the next Age of Air, roughly 463 to 165 BCE. This was an incredibly interesting period of history, particularly as it pertains to ancient Greece. It was the time of the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. These ages of air were always times of great intellectual development, and when it began, Athens was in its golden age, a high point of stability and prosperity and cultural flourishing. But the golden age was about to end. In 431 BCE, with Pluto in Aquarius, Athens went to war with a rival city-state, Sparta.
This is Sparta!
And our understanding of this comes from the historian Thucydides, who wrote about it in his History of the Peloponnesian War. But not long after the war began, Athens was hit by disaster. In 430 BC, it was struck by plague. We still to this day don't know what kind of disease this was. The prime suspects are smallpox and typhus, but it's estimated to have killed between 75 and 100,000 inhabitants of the city. And in 404 BC, the Spartans won the war. But almost 30 years of war had weakened the Greek city-states, and soon enough, a student taught by Aristotle himself, a man named Alexander, emerged from Macedonia to conquer Greece, and he forged an enormous empire stretching all the way to India. And this multi-ethnic Greek-speaking empire became a driver of intellectual development. For example, in cultural melting pots like Alexandria in Egypt, the wisdom of the peoples of Babylonia, Egypt, and Greece were fused together to create Hellenistic astrology. But what about climate change? Well, admittedly, in this period, we don't have strong evidence of that, but there is an intriguing reference in Wikipedia to a long period of cold weather known as the Iron Age Cold Epoch. Here's what it says. The Iron Age Cold Epoch was a period of unusually cold climate in the North Atlantic region, lasting from about 900 BC to about 300 BC, with an especially cold wave in 450 BC during the expansion of ancient Greece. So this especially cold wave mentioned here would take place in the first 20-year period after the first air conjunction of this Age of Air. It's pretty interesting to me that the plague of Athens emerged very soon afterwards. But now we're going to move forward in time another 800 years, and once again we're about to see the fall of another great empire. So this Age of Air would have lasted from the year 332 to 690. So you'll notice that it was very long, and the reason for that is that there were very long transitional periods at both the beginning and end. But what's clear is that this period covers the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but the demise of Rome didn't happen overnight. But if you were to put it into a single moment, you might say it happened in 476, when the German chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus. Now, historians have argued about what caused the collapse of Rome for centuries, but modern scholarship is converging on two as key: climate change and disease. This theory is described by the historian Kyle Harper in his book, The Fate of Rome, which is subtitled Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. Harper believes that the Roman Empire flourished during a particularly warm period between about 250 BC and 400. Then this warm period ended, and the new climate brought reduced agricultural productivity, crop failures, and food shortages that destabilized the empire. The land simply couldn't support the Roman population anymore, and all of this made Rome vulnerable to invasion. Now here's where things get interesting. We saw how this was a very long Age of Air when you include the transitional periods. It went from 332 to 690 CE, and this lines up incredibly well with the period that historians call the migration period, a time when there were huge movements of people across the Eurasian landmass. It's been dated to roughly the year 300 to 700. See how well that lines up with the Age of Air. In the late 4th century and 5th century, Rome came under sustained attacks by Germanic-speaking tribes. These were peoples with names like the Sarmatians, the Thervingi, and one you'll have heard of, the Goths. I don't care. Not that kind of Goths. But why did these tribes begin to push into Roman territory? Well, it's believed they were trying to escape another invading people, the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic horse-riding people from Mongolia, and they began to push west in this period. And eventually, under the leadership of their famous leader, Attila, the Huns themselves invaded Europe. And you might note that there's some kind of theme emerging here in our Ages of Air, because with these invasions of the Huns and the Germanic-speaking tribes, we see echoes of the Sea Peoples during the Bronze Age collapse. And we're going to see this happen in the next Age of Air too, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Question is, why did the Huns start pushing west? Well, there were theories, and one of them is that it was because of climate change. Edward R. Cook, a climate research specialist at Columbia University, has proposed that they were driven by drought. Cook has examined tree ring patterns going back 2,000 years, and he thinks that 3 mega droughts struck Central Asia where the Huns lived between around the year 360 and 550. Cook thinks these droughts spurred the nomadic Huns to seek better living conditions further to the west. See how everything's connected? What's more, between roughly the year 541 and 549, the Mediterranean region was hit by another terrible plague, known today as the Plague of Justinian, after the Byzantine emperor of the time. It's estimated to have killed anything from 15 to 100 million people. What kind of plague was it? It was bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. By this time, of course, only the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, remained. Plague weakened it severely, and it cut short the ambitions of Emperor Justinian to reconquer the West. And interestingly, a lot of researchers have hypothesized that climate change is what led to this plague emerging. So this Age of Air shows us vividly how factors like climate change, disease, and mass migration all combined to cause the demise of the Roman Empire. And they're all phenomena that we can link together with the air element. Now we're going to fast forward another 800 years to the next Age of Air. We're going to see the same themes appearing again. So this Age of Air lasted from roughly 1186 to 1425. But previously, between roughly the year 830 and 1100, Europe experienced what's been called the medieval climate anomaly. This was an unusually warm period caused by an increase in solar radiation and a reduction in volcanic activity. Now, this warmer weather increased the amount of land suitable for farming. This led to more food being produced, which led to a population explosion. Population of Europe tripled during this period. Somewhere between 1100 and 1300, around when our Age of Air began, temperatures began to cool, and what is now known as the Little Ice Age began. It brought cold weather and torrential rains, which damaged crops and caused disease in livestock. And just as happened with Rome in the previous Age of Air, the land could no longer support the population that had grown during the warm period. The result was starvation. Between 1315 and 1317, we saw what's been called the Great Famine. Between 5 and 12% of Northern Europe's population died of starvation, and the region was racked by class warfare and strife. But the famine later was to have other consequences which you may not expect. To feed the population, grain began to be imported from the Middle East by ship, but these ships also carried an unwanted cargo: rats. Around the middle of the 14th century, these rats carried into Europe the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and so began the episode we know today as the Black Death, a huge pandemic of bubonic plague. Between 1346 and 1553, an estimated 75 to 200 million people died across Eurasia and the Middle East. It's the same plague that struck during the previous Age of Air, the Plague of Justinian. Historians commonly cite the Black Death as leading to the demise of feudalism, socio-economic structure that locked everyone from the king at the top to the laboring serfs at the bottom into a kind of rigid hierarchy. But the plague killed so many people that it dramatically raised the value of labor. People were more in demand by landowners, and they gained more freedom to move around. If we were to try and read some kind of purpose into the plague, We could say that it broke this rigid earthy structure and made European society much more airy. And after the plague came the intellectual and cultural flowering of the Renaissance. During this same age of air, at the other end of the Eurasian landmass, nomads were stirring once again. In 1206 in Mongolia, a man named Temujin united several nomadic tribes into a confederation, and he adopted the name Genghis Khan, which means something like universal ruler. And of course, the Mongols under Genghis Khan went on to build the largest contiguous land empire that the world has ever seen. They conquered China, they conquered the Middle East, they conquered Russia, and they pushed into Europe before being turned back. And guess who the Mongols claim their descent from? The Huns, who we met in the previous Age of Air. And once again, we can ask the question, what drove the Mongols to leave their steppe pasture lands? Again, many theories have been proposed, but once again, climate change is one of the primary ones. Because as we've seen, this Age of Air saw the Little Ice Age. An anthropology and archaeology professor at the University of Maine argues that the changing climate drove the Mongols to build their empire. He said that the cooler weather lowered the snow lines in the mountains of Asia, and that brought a colder and wetter climate. This wasn't good for the Mongols' agriculture, but the wetter climate was very good for grazing livestock, such as the Mongols' horses. And this gave the horse-riding Mongols the perfect incentive to expand their empire. So once again, we find the same factors cropping up in this period: climate change, plague, structural dissolution, and mass migration. Now let's think about what all this means for us today. As we've seen, we once again find ourselves in an age of air, and we're facing the problem of climate change once again. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the current climate situation is just business as usual. There's an obvious way in which the climate change that we're dealing with today is different to those we've seen in those previous periods. This time, we're causing it. So it was our activity during the previous age of Earth that really brought us to the place we're in now. What's more, the rate of climate change seems to be much faster than anything our ancestors had to deal with. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that the Earth is now hotter than it's been in 125,000 years. And scientists believe that climate change is likely to drive disease outbreaks, and it will also change the parts of the world that are even habitable. This could force huge populations of people to have to leave their homelands and seek safety elsewhere. Now, migration is already a political issue in many parts of the world. What we could see in the future as a result of climate change will dwarf the levels of migration that we're squabbling over today. Although I'm trying to show that climate problems are, in a certain sense, cyclical, there's an obvious sense that this time things are somewhat different, because this is really an exponential age. We're progressing technologically at an exponential pace. So in an exponential age, perhaps the problems we're asked to contend with grow exponentially too. Just as this time, human activity seems to be causing climate change, there's a corollary to that. This time, it's up to us to employ our ingenuity to prevent these apocalyptic scenarios from playing out and ensuring that our world remains habitable. And here I think I also have to mention AI, which is a clearly airy phenomenon. AI is obviously going to be extremely disruptive to the societies we live in. I don't want to downplay that. But having all this raw intelligence at our fingertips is also going to give us some advantages. Could AI help us improve our energy efficiency? Could it help us develop amazing, new, cleaner forms of power generation, for example? I want to return now to the hole in the ozone layer, because this was a problem we were able to fix through coordinated global action. Perhaps it's a positive omen for how we might be able to deal with the problem of climate change during this age of air. So there you go, it's not all doom and gloom on this channel. If you want to know more about the age of air, I suggest you watch this episode next. In it I get into all sorts of trends we've seen during previous ages of air and make some predictions about what's coming in this one. That's it for this episode. See you next time.